Hi, you're watching Dog Ear Musings, and I'm Monica, and today I'm doing a book review about the novel Worry by Alexandra Tanner. Now, if you're chronically on BookTube like I am, then you probably know and recognize this cover from the months of just awesome, beautifully staged Instagram pictures that bookfluencers posted about this book the months before and during its release. Now, I definitely had some FOMO, and when I found out that this book was available for me to pick up, I went out and snagged myself a copy to read. And so these are my thoughts and feelings about my experience reading Worry. So first of all, who is Alexandra Tanner? Now, I read a really awesome interview between Tanner and one of her friends who she actually co-writes with from this website called The Literary Hub. And they talk about their writing process, especially behind Tanner's first novel, which is this book, Worry. She talks about process that she wrote and these two themes that kind of stuck with her in wanting to focus for this novel. First, the idea of tension and kind of the use of tension as a tool in both showing love and vulnerability and kind of the gaps of love and vulnerability within relationships. And secondly, the idea of repetition and repetition as kind of a driving factor within people's just daily lives. Okay, so what is the book Worry about? So Worry focuses on two sisters, Phoebe and Jules, and a summer in which the two of them decide to live with each other again. Now, they have kind of a very real relationship. It is one that is both hilarious and tense and loving. It is all of the things. And that happen when you know someone for almost 30 years. The two of them are kind of put in this very small apartment, just trying to figure out themselves and their relationship in a city that both loves and hates them at the same time. Now, what were the cons, or what kind of drew me out of this book? Now, I ultimately really enjoyed my experience reading this book, so my review is going to be a little bit biased, but I'm thinking about two things that might take a general reader outside of reading this book. Now, one of them might be that constant theme of repetition. Now, this is a book that almost feels like watching an episode of Seinfeld, where it's just it's an all vibes, kind of no plot book. So if you're somebody who isn't into that and isn't into a character study, this might not be for you. Specifically also because this book focuses on the repetitions and minutia within a person's daily life and just how funny that repetition can be, as well as the spirals within it. One thing that I also felt kind of drew me out of the book was the ending. Now, I won't go into the spoilers of the book, but I kind of left the book not necessarily wanting a resounding explosion or for all the plot points to be tied up, but it did kind of make me the ending felt like it was in the middle of something. I'm wondering if maybe that was Tanner's attempt at playing with tension, where it's you are kind of trying to, that tense feeling of pulling yourself back after being pushed away, which is a constant kind of repetitive pattern that is played between the two characters of the book. And maybe this was kind of a pattern that Tanner wanted to play on with her readers, of that kind of tense dance between love, vulnerability, and pushing away. But I wasn't really sure if that was author's intent, so that kind of left me feeling a little bit like I was left almost on a precipice wondering what. I think ultimately though, the whole book, like 80% or 90% of the book, I understood and was in for the ride, where I didn't really understand the ride, but I was there with them enjoying it. And so what were the pros of this book? I just found this book really, really hilarious. Phoebe and Jules are two people that feel like the worst parts of a person's personality come to life. They say all the things that you kind of like think about but also are too afraid to say. They are like the most detestable but also like weirdly lovable characters that I've read, and I think that again that could be a polarizing factor of the book for some, but for me, I think because of the point I was at currently in life, I found that how Tanner writes humor really worked for me, and I found these characters awful but also so real and enjoyable and just so human in their awfulness. I mean, they were just abound with insecurities, and one thing that I just really loved that Tanner explores so well is these spirals of anxiety, specifically fueled by social media. Our main character, Jules, goes on these deep, deep rabbit holes on Instagram, but also just like on social media platforms where it's just like these tangents that feel so real, and you are kind of cringing along with the main character where you're like, oh gosh, like I've been here before, and yeah, you don't know what that says about you, but then you're like, I think it's like that moment in a sleepover where you're talking about embarrassing moments with your friend and you're like, oh, you have that experience too. Oh, okay. I guess life is not as terrifying because we're all kind of terrified together. I just found the hilarity of just the anxiety, but also these two characters just so endearing enough that like, and just so real enough that I found myself recommending this book to my sister, who, if you've watched videos before, you'll know you've seen her before, and it was just really fun to be able to text each other about our experiences reading the book and what we connected with. I think that was kind of one of the best parts, was being able to share this book with my sister. And I don't know, I think it's one of those books where it's like, it explores the awesome and horrible bits of having a familial relationship in such a way that is both tender and loving, and also like knows how to hurt yourself in the worst ways. I think that's also how siblings and sisters work. Okay, so what are some books that I would recommend you read if you like this book, or if you wanted to kind of get a vibe of what worry is like? So one book that I found very similar was The Rachel Incident. It is also another book that kind of describes very human characters in a very like uncomfortable and goofy situation, like coming of age, an exploration of friendship. And I think that this is a book that just explores that relationship, again, in a way that is just beautiful and also honest, but is done in a way that is ultimately tender. Another book is Beautyland. And this is another book that, although the characters aren't ultimately unlikable, they are real and full-fledged. It's written from a very unique point of view and format of writing. And it also is another book that explores familial relationships, but also friendships in just a really interesting and nuanced way. I think if you're wanting to watch a show that is kind of similar to Worry reminded me a lot of Fleabag. It's just like that, the two sisters in that show, and just how they come together, but also like will break apart and then come back together. It focuses on, the main character, she just is filled with so much worry and anxiety and just self-loathing and guilt that she doesn't even really give herself a name. She's just Fleabag, and again is just filled with this dark humor. I think these three pieces of media are ones that are in a very interesting conversation with Tanner's work. All very unique and individual flavors that tell their own awesome story. But I think in thinking about how we explore relationships and friendships and just the humanness of those bonds, I think all three or all four of these authors do so in a way that, I don't know, I think when thinking about my own relationships and friendships and just how I feel in building my community, I think it makes me feel a little bit better. And so that brings me to, what are my takeaways in reading this book? I think ultimately what I loved most about reading Tanner's book was just like, I was reading this book and the whole time I was like, I need to share this book with somebody. Obviously I was so excited to be doing this review, but when I was reading this book, the whole time I was like, my sister needs to read this. I need to read this book and like just share this experience with her, just because it's like, it sounds bad to say that there are like pieces or fragments that felt so relatable in it, but I think it's just like, I think it's like watching an episode of Seinfeld where you're like, oh my gosh, this is just like such an outrageous situation that is written to the 10th degree, but somehow you still feel like you connect with it. There were periods where I was reading this book and I was the annoying person at work in the break room who was laughing, or who was out in the coffee shop looking ridiculous, laughing. And that doesn't really happen that often with books where I'm like physically laughing out loud. And I'm really excited to see what other books Tanner puts out. I know she's written some short stories, so I'm excited to check those out. I think that with Instagram and cover buys, there's always like this apprehension of, is it just about the cover? Is it just about like this pretty little cover with a bow on it that will make me excited just to have this book just because it will look really good on my bookshelf? And I will say that the cover definitely sold this book, but it was worth the hype, at least for me. I think this book scratched an itch that I needed to be scratched at the moment. That was really gross, but it hit at the right point in time. And I think if you're somebody who is wanting to look at all the goofy parts about relationships and enjoys some dark humor, then you might also really love Worry, or you might hate it. Anyway, this has been my book review of Worry by Alexandra Tanner. I'm Monika. Happy reading.